This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Helen Blue. I work at the University of Westminster, and I'm pleased to be chairing today's session. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Faye Hammill from the University of Strathclyde, who will be presenting on magazines, gender and hospitality in Canada and the US. Faye has recently co-authored a book with Michelle Smith titled Magazines, Travel and Middlebrow Culture, Canadian Periodicals 1925 to 1960. And as part of that work, she also founded the Middlebrow Network, so do look that up online.
Oh, I've got some more flyers.
Ooh, leaflets, we love leaflets, thank you.
Just something wrong with that.
And so today, her paper is also related to Middlebrow culture, but is sort of new stuff that sort of came out of that project but isn't in the book.
Yes, thank you. I was just making that point just to make sure. So yeah, this is really me trying out some new ideas, but actually looking at some of the same magazines that we looked at in the book, but from a different angle. So yeah, I did say Canada and the US because I have been working on various mainstream Canadian and American magazines for a while. In the first half of the 20th century, but I am going to end up mostly focusing on Canada in this talk, just so as not to go too much not at all over time, and not to make it too complicated with too many different examples. But I think quite a lot of these ideas could be applied in similar or related ways to some American magazines as well. So I'm particularly interested at the moment about ways of comparing different magazines, and this is just some of the really broad questions that I'm thinking about just now in method terms. And as I've been looking at some really quite long runs of magazines over sort of 3 decades and thinking about how do we look at the changes within one title, but also methods of comparing different titles. So I'm looking at that in collaboration with various other people at the moment. So that probably suggests rightly that I'm quite interested in the periodical as a text or a genre, which is the sort of thing you do in the English department. But I'm also interested in the way people use magazines as historical sources and how that leads to different methodological approaches. And I think to use them as historical sources, you still first want to think about them as a genre and think about how they're positioned in the marketplace, obviously, and how they construct their audience before you can start doing that. This is just some of the titles I've been having a think about in more or less detail, and that my PhD students are working on. That this sort of type of magazine is what I'm labelling as mainstream. And you could compare them along various different axes. So in the book that Helen mentioned, we mostly were looking at questions around social class. But obviously, because in this slide I've got Canadian and American examples, there would also be the axis of nationality. And then obviously gender is what I'm going to focus on today in terms of magazines aimed at men or aimed at women. So this is me just kind of trying out a way of reorienting the material more around the gender axis rather than the class one, which I've looked at primarily so far. And they sound, I think, like quite straightforward questions, but I'm not sure necessarily that they're the focus of a great deal of research, because such a lot of studies seems to be mostly just on women's magazines, or occasionally on specific men's magazines, quite often things like Esquire or Playboy that kind of idealise a more bachelor lifestyle. Whereas I've been looking at some really quite conventionally defined Canadian titles which address men and women in fairly, they kind of recommend fairly conventional roles in relation to the home and work and family and so on. So I'm really interested in whether they try to really define their audience as just men or just women, or whether they're actually trying to be a bit more inclusive in spite of their titles. And also particularly in magazines which have changed their identity, which have shifted from being men's to general interest. There's another one in the book that we wrote which started off as a feminist magazine in Quebec, and ended up as a really mainstream, really commercial women's magazine, so it completely changed its focus. So that I'm interested in those kind of shifts over time as well. Obviously I can only say some really preliminary things in 40 minutes in response to those questions, but at least it might start a discussion about sort of method questions. So just to give a bit of focus to this, I'm going to think about hospitality in order to sort of give a bit of coherence to the examples I want to look at. I found that to be a really useful way of getting at how magazines address and construct an audience, and particularly kind of gestures of welcoming in or excluding that they perform. I've got quite a lot of slides, and I'm going to go through some of them quite quickly just to very quickly illustrate a point. So if you want to come back to any of them in the discussion, then I can sort of shuffle back through. So this is the homepage for the project that I did with Michelle Smith, and those are the 6 Canadian titles that we worked on, 4 in English and 2 in French. And we chose to label them as mainstream rather than mass market or popular, which would be right in some senses, but they were quite aspirational. They were at the sort of higher priced end of the market, so they were somewhat distinct from the pulps or the really inexpensive weeklies that circulated alongside them. So we thought mainstream was the least problematic term, but we also had lots of discussions about that labelling. And the whole point of it was to compare these different magazines, to read across titles rather than just focusing on one. And I still think perhaps we don't see enough of that kind of comparative work. I've been looking quite a lot at the Journal of Modern Periodical Studies recently, which has been going for about 8 or 9 years, and it's published 38 articles so far, and 32 of them just look at one magazine, and obviously that's partly because of the size of the archive, and it's really hard to take on more than one, and that's where you start to need a collaborative project rather than just one person. But I still think it can be really productive to actually look at different case studies alongside each other. One way of doing that is through machine reading or distant reading approaches favoured by digital humanities, and that's something I'm interested in too. But there's also something called surface reading, which is perhaps more like what I'm trying to do today. There's a journal, Representations, which had a special issue on surface reading, and there's a contribution by Margaret Cohen, and she was talking about how to read a large body of material that might be quite repetitive or formulaic. She was talking about Victorian popular fiction, but I think this applies also to magazines. She says just about 4 or 5 lines down, when first opened, the documents in the archive are often utterances within the framework of lost long that need to be recovered before their full meaning emerges, and discerning new patterns from the archive of literature still requires the critical act of perceptive reading. So she talks about ways of kind of skimming content, and also of making generalisations, and how much evidence you need in order to support those generalisations if you can't read through every single word of your body of material. And in terms of periodical studies specifically, one thing that's noticeable is that the object of knowledge, which is Franco Moretti's term, as you know, is not often the periodical itself. I think it's much more likely that people are using periodicals in their research to sort of look through them to find out about something beyond. So maybe a political movement could be feminism, or an aesthetic category like modernism, for instance. So again, I'm quite interested in research that actually looks at the periodical for its own sake and tries to focus attention on it as a genre or a form. And the way that we tried to do that in this AHRC project was using the theme of mobility to connect the contents of the magazine, because there was lots of coverage of travel in them, with the way that they kind of circulated fantasies of travel, the way that they encouraged certain sort of aspirations of literally upward mobility. And we were looking at the kind of strategies that they used in the address to the reader, and the mix of content and the way that all these things combined. And to try to keep focusing attention back on the magazine as a sort of a material object in a marketplace, we tried out a series of models or kind of analogies for the magazine itself. So in one chapter we had the model of the magazine as a tour guide, which was inspired by Richard Oman's book Selling Culture, in which he talks about the editor as tour guide, and he talks about the gestures of pointing and enumerating, which are characteristic of, he's talking about American magazines around the turn of the century. And this idea, I think, allows the formal aspects, so the way that the magazines are quite similar to, say, travel brochures or photograph albums, to be related to salient topics in the content, and also to modes of addressing the audience. So if you think about being on a tour, you get taken to sort of privileged viewing positions and things are kind of framed for you and presented in a particular way. So that's quite useful looking at magazines too. And then another chapter we used the more familiar analogy about the department store, the magazine and magasin and all that, where there's a formal parallel because the magazine's quite similar to catalogues, mail order catalogues, particularly relevant in Canada. And then in terms of content, obviously that focuses your attention on the sort of consumer-based articles and the advertising material. So those were sort of models to try to connect form in the content. And so you can probably guess that I want to try out a model of the magazine as either a host or a guest, like a party or a hospitality in the home. And I'm finding this quite useful for looking at the periodical's way of hailing its audience, so sort of gestures of invitation and introduction, but also of reproof. I found that in some of the periodicals we looked at, the sort of models of sociability are quite coercive, whereas others are much more open, and that does seem to have somewhat of a gender dimension too. So just looking at the examples I've chosen, I want to kind of think what kind of party or what kind of home are these magazines inviting you to, and how do you know if you're really invited or if you might be a gatecrasher. So just to make this a bit more literal, I want to actually start with an American example. This isn't that easy to read, but Vanity Fair presented itself in its early advertisements as a dinner party. It says, Vanity Fair binds between the covers of a single magazine, the table talk of a dinner party at which cosmopolitan, well-bred, cultivated people discuss the news of their varied world. So that's the kind of drawing subscribers into a community of like-minded people. But it also is shutting out those people who don't belong, because if you're not cosmopolitan and cultivated and all the rest of it, then you're definitely not going to be welcome. And the other thing that it does is, as well as drawing the readers in, it introduces you to the current celebrities. So it talks at the bottom of this text about you need to keep up with the work of our younger and more amusing writers and artists. So they're introducing readers to each other and then also to famous people, and those two are the really key gestures. And then if you think about the magazine, instead of as the host, as the guest, that seems to have two sides to it as well. And just to really quickly illustrate that, this is one of my Canadian magazines, which is called Mayfair, but not the Mayfair that you know about. It was quite a different publication. And this is one of the early editorials in which it speculates that readers are away on holiday, but you'll surely still want to know what's going on, and you'll surely want a hint or two of autumn fashion. So Mayfair is your sort of visitor who brings you the gossip, if you like. But at the same time, Mayfair is also attending the parties on your behalf. So you need not quit the swinging Chesterfield on your cool porch actively and intimately to participate in all that which is happening throughout our broad dominion. So as it were, you ride to the hunt or you stroll at smart garden parties. So on the one hand, the magazine's visiting you in your home, on the other hand, it's your substitute. It's a kind of proxy for you. And all of these models intersect with actual coverage of hospitality in the magazines. So social columns and reports on real parties, or advice columns on how to give parties, that kind of thing. So Mayfair is one of the three titles that I wanted to focus on a bit. And this is the other two, which are Macleans and Chatelaine, which are still going as the two sort of leading mass market titles in Canada. These were all published by the same company. So it was Maclean's publishing originally, and then it became Maclean Hunter, and now it's part of Rogers Media, which owns pretty much all the media in Canada. So the first one, Maclean's, that started in 1911 under its current title, but it was previously the Busy Man's magazine. But now it's a news weekly now, though it was a monthly at first. Mayfair was a high society magazine and lasted until 1959, when the class that it was published for had kind of pretty much ceased to exist. And Chatelaine started in 1928, And there's also a French language version now, which was originally called La Revue Moderne, and was at one point a much more feminist title than it is now. So those are all available only in print archives in Canada, which makes it a bit tricky, except that the Busy Man's magazine you can get in the Internet Archive, and also La Revue Moderne has been digitised by the National Library in Quebec, so you can look back at the earlier history of these titles, but it's quite difficult to look at anything from the 20s onwards unless you're in Canada. So Busy Man's magazine I will start with. It's a kind of unpromising looking title. It started as a digest of articles from other journals, and then it started to publish original content on really exciting topics. This issue, I'm sure you can't read this, but it's got some thrilling articles on what good roads mean to the businessman, the young man as a factor in national life, and the man who stands by his convictions. So the way it reinforced its masculine identity, it wasn't by completely ignoring women, but it put them in a special department, and it insisted on their exclusion from the business world. So this volume from 1908 actually contains several articles on women and girls, and these are some of the titles. Have Women Less Conscience Than Men? Why Some Women Never Marry? The Failure of the Professional Woman? How She Answered the Call of Home? So again, not that promising. But the really interesting thing about this magazine is how quickly it changed. So that was what was going on in 1908. But when you get to 1910, it looks different already. You can see it's being divided into departments, which it wasn't on the previous page. See, that's just one big list. And now it has departments. It's starting to envisage an audience which maybe has sort of discrete segments with different interests, and there's a section called Of Interest to the Home, which just means of interest to women, written by two men. But I think I mentioned about the analogy between the magazine and the department store, so they both rely on a kind of taxonomical practice, which you can already start to see emerging in these categories: system and business management, short stories, men in the public eye, Canadian specials. So they're kind of thinking about all the different things which Canadians should be interested in. But they also, I think these categories and these departments suggest a sort of rhetoric of accumulation as well. And at this point it's the accumulation of knowledge, but when this magazine became a bit more commercial and had a lot more advertisements, it was also about the accumulation of goods as well. And then this is May 1910, and then July 1910, the Of Interest to the Home has suddenly gone all the way up here. So it's getting promoted, and it's now more important than Men in the Public Eye. And there's also now one woman writing in this section, and another one who's written a short story, whereas before this point, almost every single contributor was male. So you can actually, just by looking at the contents pages, you can already see these quite rapid changes happening. And, you know, anyone who's worked on magazines, which lots of people here have, would be aware that, you know, there would be an increasing awareness around this time of the power of the female consumer and the need to appeal to those readers. So, you know, there you can see the women's interest literally moving up the kind of priority list here. So this left-hand issue, May 1910, it starts off with this article about a man who looks like he's going to be quite busy, as he's going to be Governor General of Canada. And it describes him in the text as not like the typical upper-class Englishman whose methods are characterised by, quote, effeteness and antiquarianism. And instead it says he is, quote, good-humoured and breezy, as well as industrious and full of the spirit of good sportsmanship. So that's quite a good summary of the type of model of colonial masculinity that the Busy Man's magazine was trying to insist on. But as soon as you turn the page, there's a picture of his wife and of his sitting room in his house, and actually in his castle. So you're immediately getting invited in to the private space of his life, and also presumably this article is trying to appeal to women readers as well. Even though it's still the Busy Man's magazine, there's clearly an idea that the busy man is going to have a female figure in his house as well to keep his busy life going smoothly. And I think, you know, to keep up this kind of home which I think the magazines for men and women at this point were idealising equally, to an equal extent. There's not really much difference. And then 3 months later, in the second issue that I showed the contents page for, there's a first article I found that was like a celebrity feature that seems to be aimed primarily at women readers, about an actress called Leigh Nash. And it helpfully points out Toronto has not only been the nursery of clever and influential men in the scientific, artistic, political, commercial and social worlds, but it's also cradled many famous and beautiful women who have made their names famous. Not very well written, is it? Anyway, you get the idea. So it describes Leigh Ashwell's career highlights very briefly, and then it very quickly moves on to her domestic life, which is where, of course, her real self is to be found. And this is really quite a common gesture where the magazine is allowed to peep into people's lives, and it's obviously an early version of the sort of celebrity at home feature that we see such a lot of now. And of course we discover that all Canadian women are essentially homemakers and never let themselves become unwomanly. And I was just buying someone a new house card when I was at the station. I was really annoyed by the fact that every single one said new home, and I thought, I want to say house, but no, you can't. And they talk about Miss Ashwell's lovely home, and if anyone read that poem, it was by Ogden Nash, and it was a riposte to Nancy Mitford, and it was called Manuscript Found Under a Serviette in a Lovely Home. But it was in the New Yorker. But anyway, this makes me think of that. So Miss Ashwell has a lovely home, and there's a much longer description of that than her stage career, which was actually quite prominent. So this is a kind of typical feature of the busy man's magazine. So the women readers are being invited in, but they're also obviously being disciplined by this sort of ideology of domesticity as well. And a lot of scholars of women's magazines have made that point very often, but it's not so often made about magazines that were for men, which also seem to be performing this same function in relation to these women readers who it's not even explicitly addressing. So I thought that was maybe quite interesting. The title of Macleans changed in 1911, and as you can see, it got very much more colourful and attractive quite shortly after. So this is the 1920s, and it did face increasing competition from American imports, the Saturday Evening Post, for instance, but it did manage to thrive during the interwar period. And it also, from this point, had an editorial column, which makes it much easier to study the way the magazine addressed its audience. And I just wanted to have a look at one example of an editorial from 1925, and it describes a visit to the editorial office, the sanctum, by someone called Erd Brandt, who's what we would now call a literary agent. A middleman, they describe him as, who brings together writer and editor for the mutual benefit of each. And the editor describes a lunch party that they hosted for Brandt and the Macleans writers that they invited. So the editorial office becomes a sort of meeting place in the centre of a literary network, which was interesting. And there's a list of the writers there, and almost every single list of writers, they put the women writers at the end of the list, which I found in any number of editorials. I'm just using this one example. But when you actually look at the content of Maclean's, people like Beatrice Redpath and Norma Muir get a lot of space. So that it's not the fact that they're squashed into a corner in the magazine itself, it's the way that the editor presents them. They're the last to be introduced. But I also thought it was nice that the editorial presents the magazine almost as food here. The literary agent talks about the ingredients needed for a good story and how they all have to be wholesome. And they also talk about that Maclean's appeals to all publics and is truly representative. So on the one hand, it's very inclusive. It's trying to say everyone's going to be interested in these stories. On the other hand, you're somewhat shut out because you don't really have access to this editorial sanctum and you're not really invited to the party. You can only kind of pick up rumours about what's happening in there. That's quite representative of these Maclean publishing titles. They perform these gestures of introduction to writers. They wanted you to know about them individually. This kind of meeting of the author gesture comes up again in this editorial from 1929. It has a very chummy tone. Meet the folks in this issue. And again, there's a list of 3 male writers, and then Beatrice Redpath gets tacked on as an afterthought. And Claire Farrell, who tells us about our flying frontiersmen, has wisely swapped newspaper work for domesticity, so that's the kind of thing they greatly approve of. But I also like the little heading to this column, in the editor's confidence. That was part of their very intimate address to readers, that on the one hand, there's a real tension here because you're part of the in crowd of Maclean's readers and you're in the confidence of the editor, but at the same time, as in the previous slide, the magazine's trying to appeal to everybody and to be nationally representative and to kind of achieve a consensus. So I keep finding this sort of balancing between a notion of an intimate public and a notion of a very broad, inclusive magazine. And also it shuts out people who don't know the names of these writers. Of course. If you don't know, then you're really quite behind and not up to date, and you should have been reading a lot more issues of Maclean's. And then this is just a little text from another editorial. Welcome is embroidered on the mat for a newcomer to Maclean. So this is welcoming a new author and figuring the magazine as a house with a welcoming doormat. And that was very much the image that this magazine tried to project of, a friendly house where all Canadians were welcome, and it was a very domestic model. So Maclean's is a family home, and then in 1927 the Maclean's Publishing Company launched Mayfair, which was not for those busy people, but it was for a small Canadian leisure class and for those who aspired to join it. So it was inspired primarily by Tatler in Britain. That's just to show how similar they were. But it also drew inspiration from Vanity Fair as well. So I also have 2 pages that just show you one of the features that they copied from Vanity Fair. So it was one of those things that's balanced in between British and American models, as you often get with Canadian publications. And like both Vanity Fair and the Tatler, it tried to address both male and female readers, in obvious ways, just through the balance of advertising. That's the kind of juxtaposition that you would see throughout, but also in the way that it addressed readers through the editorials and through the mix of content. So this is a very straightforward point, but it needs to go in there for context. So the editor, J. Herbert Hodgins, would write things like this in his editorial in the bridal issue. Here comes the bride, here comes the groom, seen for the first time at his own wedding. The knowledge that he is correct to a thread in his clothes has bucked up his inferiority complex. So there's an idea that, that the male figure is going to be rather in the background at a wedding or in a sort of smart society magazine like this, but Mayfair keeps continually trying to bring the male figure back into the foreground of the picture in these slightly heavy-handed ways. And just another example of another editorial in which Hodgins writes, "Are you interested in the hunt, golf, military tournaments? If that doesn't appeal, surely the display of fashion will." So there's this continual balancing between, let's make sure we don't leave any possible readers out here. And the covers, as you can see, suggest a very frivolous kind of world with huge dresses and huge hairdos and so forth. So in a way they had to work even harder to keep including the sort of masculine elements to the magazine. So Mayfair never presented itself as a family or a home and was never kind of cosy. It much more presented itself as a fashionable party. And Hodgins took on the role of host. So this is his very first editorial. "I have the honour to present to you, our first readers, a magazine which will interpret the lives and interests of Canadians in their most gracious moods." So in those Maclean's editorials I was looking at, the editor's introducing you as a reader to the contributors, but now he's introducing you to the magazine almost as a personality. And that's kind of kept up all through Mayfair's run. So Mayfair becomes this little character who's a guest at all the best parties and picks up all the gossip and takes photographs. So it's a kind of, there's also lots of little drawings of a puck figure in the editorial column, so it's almost like a sort of ever-present figure who can sort of span the world in 24 hours and so on. And in this same first ever editorial, there's also a reflection on the title of the magazine, why they chose Mayfair. named after a neighbourhood of London, as they say, but he says it has taken on a broader but invariably exclusive interpretation. And that was one of their favourite words. They were always trying to present themselves as exclusive in all these different ways. So, for instance, by assuming that readers would recognise all the people in the pictures that they showed. So this is the debutante issue for 1927. You no doubt will recognise many of the faces that blossom on our pages. So again, there's somewhat of an ambiguity, because will they recognise these people because they really do know their families, or just because they've seen them in previous issues of the magazine? Mayfair only had a circulation of about 20,000, and it was, like Tatler now, it was read by the people who appear in it, as well as by the people who aspired to join that group. But I think if you read further down in this editorial, it really suggests that knowing the magazine is enough. Mayfair is teeming with other intriguing gossip. Another of SWA Field's intriguing letters. I will tell you about SWA Field in a minute. You know what that means if you know your Mayfair. So it doesn't explain, and it kind of addresses a reader who's already in the know, if you like, which, given it's only been going a few months, it's trying to reinforce itself as an established publication. So this gesture of flattering readers by suggesting that they're part of the inner circle was very prevalent. This is another example where the readers are back from their holidays and the editor speculates, "You may have been one of the fortunate guests at these gala events. What a pleasure to live these scenes over again on the pictured pages of Mayfair." And it's much more likely that the readers would just have to imagine themselves into the photos and into these elite events, but Mayfair is trying to emphasise its own value by suggesting how socially elite its readers are. And then quite a different way in which the magazines drew readers into a sort of imagined community of readers was by inviting them to participate in shaping the published contents. So in 1928, this advert appeared in Mayfair, inviting readers to suggest a name for the new Maclean publishing women's magazine. And you could win $1,000. Yes. So the person who won the competition was invited to write a piece for the first issue. And she remembers wondering how she could manage to suggest the charm and freshness of hospitality, the noble dignity of maternity, the presiding genius of the home, for these are the aspirations of every woman. How could one do it within the narrow limits allowed? And then she had this inspiration of the gracious figure of a Chatelaine, inviting with outstretched hands the women of Canada to enter and enjoy the restful charm of her home. And that didn't set the tone entirely, because I was just discussing this with Helen, in later years, and even at the beginning, Chatelaine was much more open and open-minded than that implies as to women's possible sphere of activity. But it did set the tone in one way, which was in this continual emphasis on the magazine as a family home and the way that it would welcome you in and make you into a kind of feminine community. And I think even when it's talking about women's work outside the home and professional effort, there's still that kind of underlying thing that it's like a friendly, welcoming home, and that was a kind of quite dominant metaphor. But it's quite similar to the rhetoric in the Busy Man's magazine and Maclean's about women as homemaker. I mean, that's not necessarily surprising, but I think one interesting thing is that this new magazine, Chatelaine, took on a lot of the female contributors who'd previously written for Maclean's. They stopped writing for Maclean's and moved over to Chatelaine. And that actually saw Maclean's almost going backwards a bit. It became a bit more male-dominated and a bit less open to articles on, say, professional women than it had been before Chatelaine was established. So there's somewhat of a fragmenting of the readership between those two titles. And I can only say that securely in relation to the first few years, like the late 20s, early 30s, because I wasn't thinking about those issues when I looked later on in Maclean's, so I didn't have it in the front of my mind, but I'd quite like to look a bit more about that. And Chatelaine, as I said, was very committed to creating this inclusive community, like an intimate public in Lauren Berlant's terms. There's a nice reader letter I found in February 1934 in which it described the magazine as like a quilting bee that, quote, unites all Canadian women into a cheery little circle. close quotes, and that was the kind of thing. So the household is also a national community, and it kind of stands in for the nation as a whole, so it's both gendered and it's national. Oops, I don't know. Sorry. Just frozen. There we go. This is another. This is an editorial which reminds me very much of that Maclean's one. It's headed "Let Us Introduce" on the left-hand side. And again, it talks about the inner sanctum of the editorial offices and their discovery of a new serial which begins in this issue. And it talks here about Chatelaine as... Oh no, sorry, I was going to make a different point. What I was going to say here was that you're being invited to share your views. You're being invited to sort of respond to the contents of the magazine in a way that does look very modern now, doesn't it? And it also suggests this notion of familiarity. Chatelaine readers are becoming very familiar with the works of Blodden Davis and so on. Do you remember her bowl of Sagamite in the September issue and her short story in the October issue? So they're really working hard to create a group of people who are going to read every issue and going to be kind of regular, and they're going to belong to this community of Chatelaine readers. So they're trying to establish this sense of continuity and community in the second year of this magazine's existence. And in terms of hospitality, the emphasis is on the reader as a hostess for her friends rather than a guest at the kind of party which Mayfair might have reported on. And the persona that was created for the magazine itself fits with that. So whereas Mayfair was sort of jetting around the world, Chatelaine is described as a monthly visitor to your home. So in the middle of this quotation, which is from Burnhope Sanders' editorial in 1933, it refers to our monthly visit, which they want to make a time of real help, pleasure and profit. So you meet Chatelaine in your house, whereas you meet Mayfair kind of gadding about. In fact, that becomes quite explicit. I found when a letter, it was an editorial that quoted from a letter in 1930, and it said, "Fancy meeting up with Mayfair here," writes a globe-trotting Canadian from the heart of Austria. So that's where you meet Mayfair, on the ski slopes, whereas you meet Chatelaine in your front parlour. And also I wanted to put this quotation in because it's got that phrase about help, pleasure and profit, which is quite a nice summary of the sort of ethos of Chatelaine at this point. There's a really strong emphasis on self-improvement and the profitable use of your time and your resources. And Maclean's has the very similar ethos to that, whereas Mayfair totally missed out the profit part and the self-improvement and just focused on the pleasure. So there's a real difference there. For instance, if you look at the fashion coverage, in Mayfair, fashion's almost like an art form and it's rather fantastical. You know, those cover images I showed, it's not, they weren't representing dresses that you would wear in real life. Whereas in Chatelaine, being nicely dressed is part of the way a wife tries to please her husband and family. And even when the magazine itself was redesigned, they sort of presented it in those terms. So this is actually the next issue from the one I just showed, but you can see it's been kind of restyled, so it looks different. And they describe it as Chatelaine with all the hopes and ambitions of a woman who wears a new hat or dress for the first time. And in this imaginary woman who stands in for Chatelaine is wondering about the effect on her family, wondering will they like it. So she's not thinking of going out into the world and posing in her new dress, she's just wondering if her husband will approve. And they also, in this editorial, there's also a reference to the new masthead. I'm not sure how well you can see that bit with the lights on the screen, but there's a lady on the left hand side who's standing in front of her castle in a kind of milkmaid outfit. And then there's a lady on the right hand side with a nice car and a big fur collar who's very modern. And it says, "This modern Chatelaine who eyes her quaint historical sister" across the top of a page. And there's a lot of emphasis on how she's proud of her skill in entertaining, and how that's a kind of traditional thing that's been handed down through generations of women. So there's a real ambition to combine, I think, modernity with traditional wisdom and sort of romantic escape with practical advice, which is sort of summed up in that little masthead, I think. And I think this very sort of inclusive ethos is quite this sort of is more confined to the women's magazine, because this bit at the end, slightly anxiously, all of us like the lady in the new hat, hope you like us. This kind of real eagerness to please does seem to be very characteristic. Whereas something like Mayfair, and even more markedly Vanity Fair, which I do want to just come back to for a moment, it showed a real difference from that. They introduced a slightly threatening undertone to the whole model of the party, or the hospitality model, suggesting to some readers that they might not be all invited to the party. So in 1926, in February, Vanity Fair asked its readers, "Are you a bore?" You may be one without suspecting it. Most of us are just beginning to be bores, a little dreary, a little spirit blighting, a little dinner killing. As a result of all this, we are not invited to the most amusing house parties, dinners or dances. And there was actually a whole series of these advertisements for the magazine itself, in which they told these stories about all these boring characters who didn't read Vanity Fair enough, and so they were actually getting dropped off all of the guest lists. And I thought it was also interesting that in the middle of this passage it says we don't meet the new celebrities. So there's this sense again that you meet the famous people through the magazines, and if you don't know them or you don't recognise them, that's another reason why you yourself are not going to be recognised, if you like. And I think, sort of slightly tangential here, but I was thinking about Derrida, because his stuff about hospitality, he talks about this word, which I can't actually say, hospitality, the title of his article, and he talks about the etymology of the word and how it carries its own contradiction incorporated into it, because the word host in Latin and French can also mean guest. And Derrida examines the authority of the host and the kind of power exerted over the guest, and the hostility contained within the hospitable. And that's probably a slightly extreme idea to apply to these frivolous magazines, but you do notice a certain kind of threatening aspect sometimes to some of the narratives about fitting in, if you like. Mayfair borrowed from Vanity Fair this idea of these little narrative advertisements for itself. And this example is called The Stigma, and the little story is about the adventures of the Downs and the Outers, Montreal's crashers de luxe, who never managed to get onto any guest lists. So they gate crash a very high-tone party and behave in a very supercilious manner, and they're quite amazed to find that the hostess doesn't realise that they're not genuine guests. And at the end of the story, one of the crashers says, "There's only one explanation, she's been missing Mayfair." And this is actually quite witty, because it was the first issue. So the magazine is itself a kind of arriviste, if you like, and it's trying to dramatise that. It generates Jim Mussel, in his work on periodical time in the 19th century, he talks about a sense of the virtual future issue and how that was inscribed into each succeeding issue of a periodical. I think it kind of does that. And just as a slight aside, I think the idea of the crashes as imitations trying to pass as real guests is something that runs through a lot of the advertising in the magazine as well. And that advert that just happens to be on the opposite page, in the small text it refers to the two coats as two distinguished originals, and there's a real emphasis in lots and lots of the advertising on the genuine, the original, and not having imitation items. I've also found that some of the adverts draw very directly on this threat of rejection by the host. So this one is particularly heavy-handed. There is always someone who is judging you. It forms quite a nice example of how the commercial materials can make a kind of blunt restatement of themes that come up in the editorial content. So in this issue from 1928, the right-hand page is an example of the fashion coverage from that issue, and it's talking about similar themes, about events that you might be going to attend and what judgments people are going to make on you. So the adverts almost kind of distill these things down and kind of hit you over the head with them. And again, if you look at recent research in periodical studies, there's a lot of emphasis on reading an issue's constituent texts in relation to one another, whether it's sort of thematic interplay, tension or reinforcement, or whether it's formal continuities. And there's a lot of reinforcement in the commercial content here of the sort of broader ethos of the editorial material. I've obviously moved slightly away from gender here in order to take this hospitality theme a bit further, but I just wanted to finish by coming back to gender by just talking about this fashion columnist. You won't be able to read it from there, but this article is by SWA Field of Paris, who I said I would mention. SWA Field's one of the very few cases where these very broadly conservative Canadian magazines do challenge conventional ideal models of masculinity and femininity. So this is 1928, and this is an example of SWA Field's style of where's the illustration? Missed that out. Anyway, this is the example of SWA Field's style of writing. So it's in a very intimate letter form, and it's quite kind of breathless, and sort of it's meant to give a feeling of being dashed off. And the reports are very much focused on the social scene where the dresses are seen and on the reporter's privileged access to it rather than on the specific details of the clothes themselves. Whereas in Chatelaine it would be dress patterns and practical things about how to make the clothes yourself, whereas here it's all about what glamorous people were wearing in the theatre foyer. And SWA Field was rather obsessed with hats. That's where I had the picture. This is the kind of illustration that appeared alongside the articles. And I've got another massive quotation here, which again I don't need to read all of it, but in one of the reports, SWA Field received an unexpected invitation for a special little tea at the Ritz, and various aristocrats and important people are going to be there. I just simply had to look my best. One gets so left behind nowadays if one doesn't do one's utmost, so there was nothing for it but a new hat. And then a bit lower down, the final operation that's performed on this hat, I suddenly had the happy inspiration to drape one of those tiny new veils just over my eyes, which absolutely gave my own creation the finishing touch. You can imagine how thrilled I felt when my hostess whispered a pretty compliment to me. And then this is all designed to prove how the Frenchwoman can be her own milliner in an emergency. But you can probably guess from the rather camp style that SWA Field wasn't really a Frenchwoman or any kind of woman. And if you look through the back pages of Mayfair, you find Richard Geoffrey SWA Field, different spelling, but it's obviously the same, Mayfair's Paris representative. And all the way through these letters, there's all this emphasis on, oh, a French woman does this, and as a French woman I can say it. It's complete nonsense. So if you think back to those Macleans and Chatelaine editorials, they give a lot of information on the contributors. They introduce you to the authors and tell you all about them. In Mayfair, there was a lot of unsigned text, and there was no fiction. And this contributor is one of the most fully characterised, and yet it's a sort of masquerade. It's a veiled figure who actually isn't revealing anything about himself unless you you sort of sort through the back pages and make the connection for yourself. So it's a kind of game. And I do think that sort of ambiguous gender-bending figure couldn't have really appeared in the other two magazines I looked at, and this Mayfair does something which is curiously more disruptive in a way. So for conclusions, I think my analysis of this hospitality theme shows that Macleans and Chatelaine are much more similar to one another than either of them is to Mayfair. So instead of having the men's magazine, the women's magazine, and the one that's aimed at both in the middle, you've actually got the men's and the women's one contrasting to the one that was aimed at both. So really the division between male and female target readerships produces a lot less effect than the division between middle class and upper class target readerships. And all three of them do rely on conventional categories of women's interest and men's topics, but they also continually connect these to issues of nationality, much more than American magazines did. The Canadian ones were much more obsessed with that, and issues of class. And I know I haven't demonstrated all these points, but what I've kind of found in the larger project is that Mayfair tries to overcome gender division with an emphasis on class identity first, and national identity to a lesser extent. Maclean's, I would say, gradually increased its tendency to use nationality as a way to trump gender in a way, and to achieve an appeal to both men and women as Canadian citizens. And And Chatelaine, slightly the other way, kind of used nationality as a way to reinforce a gendered identity, a model of the ideal Canadian woman. There's a lot more emphasis on the specific aspects of Canadian womanhood that are different from American womanhood. For example, different ways in which they would dress, different manners that they would have. So I think in more general terms, just to come back to the methodological point, these aspects become more salient when several titles are read alongside each other. It obviously means you end up on a bit of a whirlwind tour like that, rather than going into depth on any of them. But I think this comparative approach can help to focus attention more steadily on the periodical as a kind of autonomous object of study, as Sean Latham and Robert Scholes put it, rather than always looking for another object of knowledge to which it can give insight. And then I think lastly, just to finish up that hospitality point, I think the different elements of the magazine kind of work together to produce this effect of sociability, whether it's intimate, as in the women's magazines, or fashionable sociability in Mayfair. But I think there's also a certain amount of conflicting modes of address going on. So most notably, the invitation to join the in crowd is quite often countered by an intimation that you might not be worthy to do so. So what I'm really trying to do is just proceed via a metaphor, if you like, by looking at this hospitality idea in order to just find new ways of looking at how the magazines hailed their audiences and how they functioned as a textual genre. So I will stop there. That's just some of the stuff I used for this research.
Great, thank you very much.